Now, how the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court looks 5 days later. It was on Monday that President Bush announced the selection of the black conservative to replace black liberal Thurgood Marshall on the highest court in the land. Reaction has been flowing and ricocheting ever since, particularly among blacks. We sample some of that now with 5 of our newspaper editor regulars plus 1. The editors are Lee Cullum of the Dallas Times-Herald, Clarence Page of the Chicago Tribune, Gerald Warren of the San Diego Union, Cynthia Tucker of the Atlanta Constitution, and Irwin Knoll of the Progressive magazine in Madison, Wisconsin. The plus 1 tonight is Noah Griffin, Jr., a columnist for the San Francisco Examiner. Clarence Page, how do you feel about the Thomas nomination 5 days later?
Well, it seems to have been a master political stroke on President Bush's part. Remarkably, in some ways, Clarence Thomas can be viewed politically as a black version of Robert Bork. He's quite conservative in his views, as much as we know about his views, but we're not seeing the kind of opposition well up that we saw well up against Bob Bork, partly because black Americans appear to be somewhat divided. My own father-in-law, if he's any indication, is thrilled that President Bush named a black man, whether he's a conservative black man or not, and I think a lot of other black Americans feel the same way. Over time, I think we'll all get a closer examination of his beliefs as opposed to his background, and some of that support may fade, but black leadership is not coming out with both barrels against him, and I think we're going to see he may get an easier ride at this point than Bob Bork.
Noah Griffin, you are less than thrilled by this nomination, correct?
I'm not thrilled at all, and I don't know any African Americans who are thrilled. I think, unfortunately, Clarence Thomas represents a new breed of conservative African Americans who don't know who they are, where they are, or how they got there. Sadly enough, he's not reflective of the mainstream of black thinking. He's not even on the shore. He's out in the desert somewhere, walking a path that somebody else has paved and calling himself a pioneer.
Meaning he's a conservative and black shouldn't be conservative?
No, I think if you're going to have somebody on the Supreme Court who's reflective of the black experience, who brings that great deal of sensitivity that Clarence Thomas says that he has as a result of growing up black and poor and impoverished in the South, he ought to represent the mainstream of black thinking. Every group has their Quisling, and unfortunately, I think Clarence Thomas is ours.
Cynthia Tucker, do you agree he's a Quisling?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a bit unfair. I think that Judge Thomas's experiences growing up black and poor in the segregated South are very authentic. He remembers where he came from. He happens to disagree, however, with the mainstream of black thought. That does not mean that I am one of those who agrees with his views. I have long admired him, but I disagree very vigorously with his views. But there's something else about his nomination that we haven't talked about yet. I think that Judge Thomas and his backer and promoter, President Bush, have managed to impale themselves on a bit of a contradiction. Judge Thomas is known for being a vigorous opponent of affirmative action. Well, the fact of the matter is, and conservatives have tried to tiptoe around this, but Judge Thomas has been selected precisely because he is black. For all those reasons that Clarence Page talked about earlier, President Bush understands that it is more difficult for civil rights groups to oppose a black conservative than a white one. If Judge Thomas were white, he would still be sitting on the federal bench, taking a few more years to get some experience on the bench. None of this means that he is not qualified. I think he has the minimum qualifications, but he's been noticed by conservatives because he is black.
Do you agree with that, Noah Griffin, that if he was a white man, he would not have been appointed?
I think that's absolutely true. I think that Clarence Thomas couldn't carry Justice Marshall's law books at the time that Justice Marshall, Judge Thurgood Marshall, as an attorney, was nominated to the court. He was a judge on the circuit court. He was Solicitor General of the United States. He'd argued successfully 29 of 32 cases before the High Court. I think we've got someone here who claims that he's against affirmative action, yet in every specific instance in his life, he's been the beneficiary of affirmative action. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a specific move afoot to bring blacks in greater numbers to law schools such as Yale. He was a beneficiary of that program. He's someone who had a tax background and ecology background, yet he was put in positions of Assistant Secretary to Civil Rights and Department of Education, head of the EEOC. There again, race played a major factor in those appointments. So for him to think that race played no factor and that he was just eminently qualified, I think is wrong.
Jerry Warren, how does it look to you from San Diego, the Clarence Thomas nomination, and this particular argument we've just been hearing?
Well, I think that argument you've just been hearing is, are people struggling for reasons to oppose what I think is a very good nomination. I think Clarence Thomas is a product of this system. He is proof that this system works. He has shown great independence, and some of that independence is galling to the civil rights leaders today. He's shown that he can do a lot of different jobs. I think he's a very good appointment.
Do you agree, though, that he is a product of affirmative action?
I think he's an opponent of the way affirmative action has been applied by the civil rights hierarchy, that you must hire certain numbers because that's the only way that blacks can succeed or can prosper. I think he opposes that, and he should oppose that. He is ample evidence that that is not the case.
Irwin Noel, how's it look to you?
Well, I think we ought to begin by acknowledging that the Supreme Court is a political institution, despite all the mythology to the contrary, and that presidents, including this president, make ideological appointments to that institution. And Judge Thomas suits the president's ideology. He's a perfect fit. Furthermore, he is black, and that means that the liberals who would oppose vigorously a white candidate with the same views are not going to oppose him that vigorously. But I think from the perspective of the country, he's a terrible choice because we have really serious problems in this country. We do have disadvantaged minorities. We do have people who, without the active intervention and protection of the government, are going to be in terrible trouble, are now in terrible trouble. And to put on the Supreme Court still another person who says, I'm all right, Jack, and devil take the hindmost, is a terrible mistake.
But as a practical political matter, Irwin Noel, wouldn't you not expect a conservative Republican president to appoint a conservative Republican to the court?
I certainly would, Jim. I said that. I think it is a political appointment. I think every president makes political appointments. I certainly hope that nobody's going to waste time with foolish chatter about whether this man has enough judicial experience or judicial temperament and so on. Those are not the considerations. The considerations are, will this particular judge, when he's on the Supreme Court, come down the way the Bush administration wants him to? The obvious answer is yes. So he's a good appointee from the president's point of view, and I think a terrible one from the point of view of the American people.
What about the point of view of Lee Cullum in the Dallas Times-Herald?
Jim, we view the nomination with skepticism. Now, I am going to waste some time on qualifications, even though Irwin Noel doesn't want me to. I regret that we've come to the point where the best experience is no experience and the best record is no record. There's something absurd in all of this. I realize it's the way to get a candidate past the Senate. I also take issue with him as an affirmative action candidate nominee. He has a distinguished educational background. He's come a long way from where he started. I think that's admirable. And given the views he apparently holds, I think he certainly might have been nominated had he been white.
Do you think he would have been?
Yes, I do.
Do you believe, Lee, that he should be questioned directly and severely about his views on other matters like abortion, say?
Yes, I certainly do. I think his views on the Constitution are certainly germane. His views on the right of privacy, which was the basis of the abortion ruling, are germane. I would also say freedom of speech figures in when you think of what doctors may and may not say now in federally funded clinics. I think separation of church and state is an issue in the choice matter. I think we ought to know how he feels about these issues.
But as a practical matter, he's already said, and already thus far said, and there have been indications that he will do exactly what David Souter did, which was not reply to any question that relates to something that could come before the Supreme Court. So then what?
Then what? Well, the Senate has a right to advise and consent, and I think if they don't have adequate information, perhaps they should not consent to this appointment.
Clarence Page, do you see any signs that a serious effort will be launched against the Clarence Thomas nomination by civil rights leaders or anyone else?
Well, I see the rudimentary signs of it in terms of a lot of feverish investigations are going on. Also, the groundwork was laid in the hearings by the Senate Judiciary Committee for Thomas's appellate court appointment when Senator Paul Simon from Illinois and others indicated that they were going to give him a voice vote in his support now, but if he comes up for the Supreme Court, that's a different matter. A lot of investigations are going on now by the press, by independent organizations looking at Thomas's background, trying to figure out what his beliefs are on critical questions like abortion and others. Over the next few months, the news about his background will be old news in terms of his Horatio Alger struggles. The story about his beliefs will be the new news, and I think we may see some more opposition welling up. I still don't think it'll be enough to stop his confirmation, however.
I noticed today that now the National Organization for Women announced their formal opposition. Clarence, how do you respond to Noel Griffin's statement, strong words about Clarence Thomas being a quisling to his race?
I think at this point in time, it's beside the point, Jim. Questions about quislings or Uncle Toms are really name-calling a person for the person as opposed to their beliefs. Whether you're talking about Clarence Thomas or Shelby Steele or Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams, there are black conservatives out there. It is true they are outside the black mainstream. It's also true they're probably closer to the white mainstream. But I think Clarence Thomas, certainly his nomination and what I think is going to be his appointment, they're going to give a new level of credibility to black conservatism. It's not my philosophy, but it's one that needs to be looked at, debated, fully put out there on the table. And I think a lot of black Americans, too, it is true that, I mean, I do know of some black Americans who like Thomas. I do know of opinion polls that show a lot of support for Thomas among black folks who don't agree with his beliefs. So I think that there's a lot of room for debate. And at this time, Erwin Knoll's right. We do have serious problems out there. I'm not going to say liberals have a monopoly on the answers. And I think maybe Thomas might open the doors to some serious debate and vigorous discussion that we need.
Noah Griffin?
Well, I think a serious debate and serious discussion is one thing, but the Supreme Court has been the court of resort for which the black community has always turned when the executive and the legislature has not had, the legislative branch has not had the political will or the courage to act. It's been the Supreme Court that has given black people the right to have a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. The Supreme Court that's given black people the right to send their children to integrated schools. Supreme Court that's given the black community the right to send their children to libraries, etc. So it's very, very important who's on that court and what views they represent. So to me, it's just not a matter of esoteric debate or intellectual concern. It's a question of what person is going to be on there and what views do they hold, and are those views going to be consistent with the sensitivity that I expect and would like from somebody who's a black appointee to that court.
May I check just one quick point?
Yes.
Whether it's Thomas or somebody else, it's going to be a conservative. We know that. And if Thomas were to be rejected, that will free President Bush to name somebody else who undoubtedly will not be black, may not even have the kind of background in poverty and struggle and the readings of Malcolm X, et cetera, that Clarence Thomas has. So I think it may be a toss-up between the devil we know and some devil we don't know. And in that regard, I think that's why a lot of black Americans favor his confirmation.
What about someone like a...
Let me just ask Cynthia Tucker, beyond your own views, Cynthia, how do blacks in, you thus far after 5 days, how do blacks in Atlanta feel about this nomination? Has there been any reporting done on that in your city?
We haven't done any reporting specifically. I can only respond by telling you what friends of mine have said and what some lawyers around town have said. And that is that they respond much as Clarence Page reflected earlier, that there's an ambivalence. And I think one of the things that you will see is that it will be abortion rights groups that will take the lead in opposing Judge Thomas's nomination. I think civil rights groups are hanging back, at least for now, because Clarence is right. President Bush's nominee is going to be a conservative. The person appointed to the seat is going to be a conservative. And so I've heard many of my friends say, while they disagree with many of Judge Thomas's views, they admire his background, his struggle to get where he is today. They'd rather see a conservative who grew up poor and who understands the vicious force of discrimination. And I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that Judge Thomas has never said that he's not been discriminated against. He's made it very clear that he's faced racism. At least he understands what that's about. And many of my friends say it's better to have that kind of justice on the bench than a justice who does not understand racism at all.
Jerry Warren, what would you say to those who have suggested that Clarence Thomas and other black conservatives are being used by white conservatives by being appointed to jobs like this and thus eliminating liberal opposition and all that sort of thing? You know what the argument is.
Yeah. I think they're specious arguments. I think for any group in the United States to say there can be no diversity within this group, there can be no new ideas brought into this group, is a terrible, terrible mistake. President Bush was asked to appoint someone who brought diversity to the bench, to appoint someone who is independent in his thinking. Clarence Thomas does both of those things.
Erwin, would you see a major effort being mounted against this man? No, is that right? You think that he's going to make it and that this is almost an academic exercise at this point?
Well, I think both. I think there will be a major effort made, particularly by women's groups who recognize that this is sort of the hour of trial on the issue of choice and abortion. And they will make a very strong effort. I don't think it's likely to succeed. I want to make the point, Jim, that of course it's correct to say that Judge Thomas has had the experience of hardship, of discrimination, of bigotry. He's made it the hard way. But some people who make it the hard way conclude from that everyone can make it the hard way. And that's simply not true. And so when Clarence Pages, I think Clarence, by the way, is soft on people named Clarence, but Clarence Pages is absolutely right when he says that liberals don't have all the answers to these terrible problems we have in America. The difficulty with Judge Thomas is that he doesn't even seem to realize that the problems exist.
Lee, your view of that? That Clarence Thomas doesn't understand what the problems are in this country?
Oh, I don't see how that can possibly be true. You don't come where he came from. You don't have the discrimination that he had at the seminary where he was supposed to learn the laws of God and was insulted. You don't have those experiences and forget them. I just don't think it's true. I do want to say that women have the most to lose in this appointment. I really do. I think the right to choice is the issue here. I think civil rights certainly is in some jeopardy, but not nearly the jeopardy that right to choice is. The die may already be cast where that matter is concerned, but women's groups, I think, will be critically concerned with this nomination.
And mount the major opposition.
Oh, yes, I think so.
All right, we have to leave it there. Thank you all very much. Noah Griffin, thank you for joining us from San Francisco.
Next, some end-of-the-week political analysis from our regular team of Gergen and Shields. That's David Gergen, editor-at-large at U.S. News and World Report, and Mark Shields, syndicated columnist with the Washington Post. Gentlemen, let's pick up on this discussion we were just listening to. David, what about this Thomas nomination? Was this a smart move by the president?
It's a smart move, and I think he's going to be confirmed fairly handily. Politically, he'll have the Republicans with him, not only the conservatives in the Republican Party, but Senator Jack Danforth of Missouri, of course, who's been leading the fight to get a civil rights compromise on the civil rights bill, is very firmly and will be the best friend of Clarence Thomas in the Senate. He'll rally a lot of moderates. And beyond that, the people who sank the Bob Bork nomination were Southern Democrats, and I think a lot of those Southern Democrats are going to vote for Clarence Thomas.
And Mark, what about the opposition? Are they going to rally? I mean, today we had the National Organization for Women saying they're going to fight this thing tooth and nail.
The National Organization for Women and the National Abortion Rights Action League, I think, are the only two groups that are out so far. And Senator Metzenbaum has indicated, Senator Cranston. I think it's going to be a lot tougher. I think David's right. I think it's going to be a lot tougher than any fight was against Bob Bork, where you could put together a coalition of labor and the Southern moderates in the Democratic Party. I think Southern Democrats Democratic senators are going to be hard-pressed to vote against Clarence Thomas for the reasons, some of the reasons we heard in the discussion. I think the other thing, Judy, that was masterful was the introduction of him to the public. Contrast that with the introduction that we got of Dan Quayle in 1988, where he was brought up on a riverboat in New Orleans, and he was kind of too excited and too happy and too animated and then defensive about questions. Here's a man, we learned about him in the first few hours, that he grew up fatherless in the segregationist South, taught by white nuns who risked being called nigger sisters to teach him. I mean, it's an absolutely marvelous story, and he thanks his grandparents, was without indoor plumbing till the age of 7. It's going to be awfully tough for senators who grew up on winter vacations, tennis camps, and room service to suggest that he doesn't understand civil rights.
Absolutely. And let me go beyond it. Clarence Page made an interesting, I think, good point in the last discussion, and that was the initial story is about biography, and his biography is an inspiring one. But increasingly, we in the press are going to start looking at what he believes. And I think as we take a closer look at what he believes, particularly in civil rights, he will be a more compelling candidate.
Why is that?
Well, because I think a lot of what we just heard by, say, Noel Griffin calling him a quisling, and Mr. Noel saying he was in an I'm all right Jack school, he's forgetting his roots and so forth. That simply is not true. This is a man who has come up the hard way, very much remembers people at the bottom, is not a particularly close friend of the middle class, but still fights for the people at the bottom, and who is in nobody's camp. He leans conservative, but he is not a quisling of the Reagan or Bush people. When he was in the Reagan administration, he openly attacked the administration for dragging its feet on the Voting Rights Act. He attacked the administration for its decisions on Bob Jones University. He attacked the administration for not offering a more positive vision. He was almost not reappointed to the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission because the Reagan administration wasn't sure he was their man. And even on the Court of Appeals, when he went to the Court of Appeals, there were some questions in the Bush administration because they couldn't count on him. This is a very independent fellow who's going to be very tough on people who won't help those at the bottom, but he's also going to be very tough on liberals whose help seems to create dependency rather than true help.
Well, Mark, that just bolsters your case. This is going to be a very tough one for the Democrats and for the liberals to put up a fight against.
Oh, I think it will be. I mean, I think he will be confirmed, barring some smoking gun, some disclosure. Yes, I really do. I don't see the will or the political resources to put it together. I think the discussion should not overlook the two patent untruths that come from the White House, that race was no factor. I mean, George Bush was clearly...
David, you're nodding your head.
I absolutely agree.
I mean, it was certainly a factor, and it was nice to see George Bush recognize that affirmative action does work. I mean, that there are qualified people who do represent diversity and all the rest of it.
Even though the president said it was not a factor.
Even though the president said it was not a factor. The other one was that the president never asked him about Roe v. Wade or his position on it or anything. I'm sure the president didn't, but I don't think anybody would have been brought into the Bush bedroom at Kennebunkport that there wasn't at least a suspicion as to where he might come down on that issue.
On
I mean,
abortion.
I think that's an issue that is of some concern, and his judicial philosophy is. And I think, no, George Bush didn't ask him about it, so George Bush had the cloak of deniability that he could
Well, the
invoke.
vice president was quoted today as saying that he wasn't asked about it.
That's, yeah.
At what level, we don't know.
Right. I think Mark is right, though. I do think that his race did play a factor. I think it was much more a question of balancing, which has been very traditional in appointing people to the Supreme Court. We talked about that last week. But I also feel that Mark is right about abortion perhaps being a more controversial aspect of his views. I don't know what he feels about abortion. I don't think he's fully on record on that subject. But I do think when it comes to civil rights, this man represents a fresh voice, and I think a lot of people are going to find it a very attractive and compelling voice.
Just a couple of...
I'm sorry, just one thing, just to add, and that is the Democrats, I think the lesson that's been driven home is if you want to influence Supreme Court decisions, you've got to win the White House. You can't lose it 5 out of 6 times and expect to have some sort of a perpetual lock on a liberal majority in the Supreme Court.
Exactly
Another subject I want to bring up, we just have a couple of minutes, is the economy. We had new unemployment figures come out today. It's up again against, I think, the expectations of many economists. The White House says, no, we're still on the verge of a recovery. David?
Well, I think the White House pointed out quite correctly that unemployment tends to be a lagging indicator. In other words, after the economy has already started to turn around, unemployment still goes up a bit, and then it starts to turn around too. I think the truth is we're not quite sure whether we're coming out of the recovery yet. There are some mixed signals. The White House thinks that.
We saw that in the Paul Solomon report earlier.
Exactly. The White House, I think, thinks that we're coming out, and there are some solid indications that we are, but I don't think we can all take comfort in that. I do think within the next 2 weeks we'll have the reappointment from the White House of Alan Greenspan as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. I think that will bolster the markets. I think that will shore up the markets because they have a lot of faith in his capacity and his leadership of the Fed.
Anybody who thinks government doesn't influence the politics of the economy is crazy. I mean, what we have now is we have an administration that boasted, two administrations of 87 months of successful economic growth and prosperity and all the rest of it. Now we're into, that mantra has been dropped, obviously, for compelling public reasons. But we're in a situation where because of the budget deal, there are no arrows left in the economic quiver. That you can't suggest what are the traditional remedies of a deficit, of cutting taxes to spur economic growth, of deficit spending, of a large public works project because of the budget agreement that was forged last fall.
So you're saying it has to get better. I mean, they're out on a limb at this point.
I think they're very much out on a limb, and I think they run the risk of having predicted 7 of the last 6 non-recoveries. I mean, each time it's the rosy shades and the brightest scenario. It's back to David Struckman in 1981.
This is the political vulnerability, and their problem is going to be because the recession has been more shallow than past recessions. The recovery, and even in the minds of many of the wise people, the White House may not be a booming recovery. It may be a very modest recovery. And that is going to continue create continuing hardships.
And just quickly, people still aren't blaming the president, presumably.
Not yet.
No, ironically, they're not, Judy. I mean, this is traditionally and historically, it's been the other party that's been the beneficiary, the party in power that suffered. But still, last Wall Street Journal poll I saw and it showed by a margin of 2-1, they thought the Republicans were better at getting out of the recession.
It's the governors who are having to play hard, take this in the neck right now.
We're going to be talking about that. David Gergen, Mark Shields.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.